So one aspect of population biology is looking at survivorship curves. So as a reminder, remember populations are groups of organisms of the same species. So we're talking about a pride of lions or a murder of crows or even a population of humans. And one way we can define those populations, or at least characterize those populations, is looking at survivorship curves. And that's what this graph that you see here is representing. And it's currently showing 3 different types of survivorship curves. Now I'll talk about each of those types individually, but what I want to point out is that all of these types are on the same x and y axis. So for example, you see on this x-axis is age in relative units. So essentially we're not saying from 0 to 100 years old, because as you can see, we're comparing 3 different species that are going to have 3 different lifespans. So these graphs have been kind of stretched and skewed in a way so that we're talking about the youngest organisms in that population and the oldest organisms in that population. Not necessarily 0 years old and 10 years old or 50 or 100 years old. So you have age on the x-axis. On the y-axis, you're going to see this a couple different ways, but it's more or less survivorship. This particular one says number of survivors on a log scale. We're not really going to use that. We're typically going to use a percentage. So what percent of that population has survived? What percent of that population is alive during each of these age units? So for example, if we look at age essentially 0, so just born, all organisms start at 100% survivorship. But depending on the type of survivorship that population undergoes, you might have a huge die-off of offspring. Offspring might have a high likelihood of survival, or you might have medium survivorship your entire life. So let's take a closer look at each of these different types of survivorship. So first one, type 1 survivorship. And you can denote this by this curve you see here. And I would highly recommend in your notes actually drawing these different graphs. So what you notice is that at a young age, again, we're starting at 100% survivorship. All of our curves start at 100%. But you notice it still stays pretty high. It's staying at 98%, 95%. And it's not until much later in life where we see this survivorship or the number of individuals still alive start depleting very quickly. So these organisms, more or less, like if you're born, you're going to survive. And then you're going to live a pretty long life until you don't anymore. So for example, humans are like this. When we have a child, most likely that child is going to survive, and is going to survive quite a long time until old age. Yes, there are things that happen along the way. That's why this isn't 100% survivorship forever, but it's pretty high. So this red question that came up, what characteristics enable this to happen? Well, think about humans. Why does this happen? Well, with humans, you can think, well, we have healthcare, but don't think of it that way. Think about our life cycles. So for one, we have parental investment. We, as the parents, ensure the survival of our offspring. There's a lot of organisms that don't do that. For example, many frog species lay a whole bunch of eggs, and that's it. Good luck. There's no parental investment there. It's just that once the eggs hatch, they're on their own. So we have a lot of parental investment, meaning we're feeding them, so making sure they don't starve. We're protecting them from predation. So essentially enabling our offspring to survive. Another characteristic that helps us out is typically we have very few young. But because we have few young, they're typically better developed. If you take a look especially at deer or giraffes or a lot of our four-legged friends, when they give birth, it's only 1, maybe 2 individuals, and those individuals can start walking pretty quickly. They already have the tools because they were typically in utero longer. They usually already have the tools in order to survive. They can now run. They can now move forward in survival. So these are all different types of characteristics that you see in a population that has type 1 survivorship. Now you would think type 2 would be logically what would come next, but I'm going to go to the other extreme first and talk about type 3 survivorship. Now these guys, if you look at the graph, and again, I highly recommend plotting this, it starts at 100% survivorship, right? You have to start somewhere. There was 100 individuals born. But what characterizes type 3 is that they have very low survivorship. This would be those frogs, for example. They might lay 100 eggs, so 100% survivorship, but a lot of those eggs might not hatch, or they might get eaten, and the frogs never even hatch. Or you can think about this in the term of plants too. If you think about a walnut tree, or an oak tree that makes acorns, that oak tree is releasing tens of thousands of acorns every season. But how many of those actually turn into an oak tree? Very, very little. So the survivorship is very low at a young age. However, once you kind of reach a certain point, let's say, a third of the lifespan, then survivorship actually increases, or it at least levels out. So not tons and tons of organisms are dying. Yeah, they're still dying, but they're living long. So if that oak tree ends up being able to grow, the likelihood of survivorship at that point is good. It's really good. Another thing with these individuals, so as I mentioned before, they might have a lot of offspring, but the survivorship's low, usually because there's not a lot of parental investment. That frog isn't watching over the eggs, that frog isn't feeding their offspring, but then also, on the opposite of type 1 survivorship, that their young are typically born premature. So they don't have all the tools for survival. If you look again at that frog example, they grow into tadpoles. So they're very, very small, they're very underdeveloped, and so they don't really have that many tools to ensure that they survive. So essentially type 3 survivorship is the very opposite of type 1 survivorship, especially when you talk about those characteristics that ensure survival at a young age. And then finally, something kind of in between is our type 2 survivorship. And this is saying that the likelihood of surviving is pretty much the same throughout their lifetime. There's not a huge decrease or increase at a young age or at an old age or in the middle age. You kind of equal likelihood of dying at all stages in your life, which can be seen as good or bad. A good example of this is a lot of birds. So a lot of birds will lay a nest, let's say of 4 eggs, and more than likely one of those eggs either won't hatch or gets predated upon. So it's 4 individuals, and at least in this early stage, only one got lost. And then they all hatch. They're usually the mother, we'll say duck, is there to feed them and protect them, but I mean they're still pretty small and they can't fly yet, and so more than likely at least one will get predated upon just because they're kind of underdeveloped, at least compared to an adult. And then when they get to the adult stage, even though they're adults, they're still fairly small as compared to hawks or snakes, so they're kind of likely to be predated upon even as adults. So for example of ducks, you kind of something's going to kill you at every point of your life. These species are kind of different. They might have premature young, they might have developed young, they might be large in size, small in size, they might have prenatal care, they might not. So if you see a question about like what type of survivorship does this organism have, really think about what are the different ways they could die throughout their lifespan. And I'll probably give you some clues to that in the question itself. So in summary, a way we can describe populations is by really understanding their survivorship and where individuals survive. Type 1 would be an example of humans. We have really high survivorship in our younger years before kind of going off into the end. Then you have type 3 survivorship, which has very low survivorship in the early years in life, but then once you make it, you've made it. And then you have type 2, which is something kind of in between, where your likelihood of survivorship is about the same throughout your lifetime. Now, something I want to say, and something you might have thought of while you were watching this is, well, what about this example? Or what about that example? It doesn't fit this curve, it doesn't fit that curve. This is a human or scientist construct. Not all organisms fit perfectly into one of these three types. This is just our best way of organizing organisms. But you could very well come across an organism that has type 1 and type 2 characteristics, or type 2 and 3, or something that just doesn't fit in this altogether. But for the purposes of this class and things that we'll be testing in this class, I'm going to try to use very clear examples that demonstrate each of these types of survivorship curves. So now that you're done watching this video, be sure to take the pre-lab quiz on Blackboard, and in lab this upcoming week, we're going to be looking even closer at these survivorship curves, particularly human survivorship.